Oakwood Cemetery was still. The kind of stillness that settles over places soaked in grief and memory, where even the birds seem to quiet their wings in respect. The sun hadn't yet risen fully over the horizon, and a soft October mist rolled across the dew-kissed grass like the lingering breath of the departed. Standing alone among the granite and marble headstones was a man shaped by years and burdened by love. Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper, 70 years old, spine still straight as a flagpole, stood motionless beside the fresh grave of his wife. The headstone read, Margaret Ann Kemper, beloved wife, mother and friend, 1954 to 2025. It was a simple inscription, but it said everything that mattered. Roland wore the only good suit he owned, a navy blue blazer with gold buttons, the same one he'd worn 28 years ago when he accepted the Bronze Star. The suit hung looser now. His once powerful shoulders shrunk from age and decades of silent suffering. His lapel bore a tiny American flag pin, dull but proud. His military-issue shoes, carefully polished that morning, sank slightly in the wet earth. He had not moved for more than an hour. His lips moved now and then, inaudible to anyone else. But to Roland they were not whispers. They were dispatches, final reports, notes to his commanding officer in the war of life. The war had taken many forms over the decades, but Margaret had been his one unbroken front, the partner who patched his wounds when the battlefield was no longer jungle or desert but the mind. "I didn't forget," he muttered, almost reverently. "Told you I wouldn't. I came just like I promised." The cemetery was officially closed. The gates had shut just after sunset the night before, and visiting hours would not resume for another hour, but Roland hadn't left after the funeral the day before. No one noticed. People assumed someone had driven him home with the rest of the mourners, but Roland had stayed, fading into the landscape like the old oaks that bordered the grounds. He hadn't meant to trespass. He hadn't even thought of it in those terms. He just couldn't leave. Because in the military, you never left a fallen comrade. He thought back to his first deployment, Vietnam. He was barely 19. He'd seen men die in rivers, in rice fields, in helicopters shot from the sky. He had learned what it meant to be left behind, and he had vowed never to let it happen to someone else. Margaret wasn't a soldier, but she'd fought her own war. 3 years of brutal chemo, surgeries, and the slow loss of self, and he'd been her caretaker every step of the way. He'd promised her he'd never leave her alone. So he stayed, through the night, sitting beside her grave with a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, a thermos of black coffee, and his memories. At 6:14 a.m., a police cruiser pulled up to the cemetery gate. Officer Danny Morrison, 24, was barely out of the still trying to make a name for himself. His shift had started at 5 a.m., and he'd been drinking bitter gas station coffee and scrolling through dispatch reports when the call came in. A groundskeeper arriving early had spotted a man loitering inside the cemetery, possibly homeless, possibly intoxicated. Morrison flicked on his lights and headed toward the gate. He was eager, too eager. He parked just outside the entrance and walked in through the service gate. It took him less than 5 minutes to find Roland. The old man stood still, hands clasped in front of him. Morrison observed him from a distance at first. He wasn't what he expected. No unkempt hair, no filthy clothes. The man looked dignified. But policy was policy. Morrison approached. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice tight with the clipped professionalism he'd been trained to use. Roland turned slightly. He looked the young man in the eyes. "I just need a few more minutes. This was her resting place. She was my wife. 43 years. I lost track of time." Morrison checked his watch. Official visiting hours began at 7 a.m. "I understand, sir, but the cemetery is currently closed. You're trespassing on public property." Roland's face was unreadable, the kind of look worn by men who've seen too much to be surprised anymore. "I didn't mean to break any law," he said. "I was here all night. I just wanted to be close to her a little longer." Morrison stiffened. "You've been here all night?" He glanced around. "That's not permitted. I'm going to need to ask you to leave immediately." Roland nodded slowly. "Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes to finish saying goodbye." Morrison saw only defiance, a delay. He'd been warned about older individuals using grief as a pretext for non-compliance. Training emphasized maintaining authority. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to take action." Roland sighed, not in defiance but in defeat. "Son, I buried her yesterday. We were married since 1981. Just let me stand here for a few more breaths." Morrison didn't hear the heartbreak. He heard challenge. He radioed for backup. Within 15 minutes, 2 more cruisers had arrived. The cemetery, once silent, was now disrupted by flashing lights and the static of police radios. Roland had sat down on a nearby bench. His joints were stiff. His legs weren't as strong as they used to be. The weight of grief had stolen his strength. The officers saw an old man slumped on a bench and interpreted it as non-compliance. "Sir, stand up. Place your hands behind your back." Roland looked at them as though waking from a dream. "I'm not resisting," he said softly. "I just need a moment." Cuffs around his wrists. Too tight. Too quickly. Roland flinched. In that moment, something in his chest broke. Not a bone, not a muscle, but something deeper, something sacred. A sense of dignity forged in war zones, in labor, in marriage. A lifetime of sacrifice crushed under the weight of cold steel and a misunderstanding. His knees buckled slightly. The officers grabbed his arms. From the edge of the cemetery, a sound echoed across the grounds. Not a shout, a cry. A single gasping sound that didn't belong to someone resisting arrest, but to a man who had nothing left to lose. And in that moment, unknown to the officers, a woman nearby, a local shopkeeper named... The morning after the incident at Oakwood Cemetery, a low fog drifted over the quiet town of Brentwood. It clung to the sidewalks like a reluctant farewell, as if even the morning itself was unwilling to face the events of the day before. News vans had already begun lining up outside the cemetery gates, their satellites pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers trying to catch the early light. In a modest bungalow just 3 blocks from the cemetery, Roland Kemper sat on the edge of his bed, a light blanket folded neatly beside him, his hands, still trembling slightly from the residual trauma of being tasered, rested on his knees. He wasn't thinking about the sting in his back or the bruises blooming along his ribs. He was thinking about Margaret, about her laugh, about the way she'd always known when he was lying about being okay. The silence in the house was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that filled in spaces where love used to live. On the nightstand sat the letters, 7 of them, each carefully addressed to a name he'd scribbled on the back of an old envelope as he lay in the hospital for observation the evening before. They were thank you letters to the young Marines who had formed a human shield around him as he knelt beside his wife's grave. He hadn't been able to finish them all. Every time he started to write about what they'd done, the pen would slip in his grasp, and he'd feel the tears sting again. He stood slowly, his joints stiff and rebellious, moving hurt, but it was a familiar kind of pain, like the kind he'd felt after long marches or sleepless nights during combat. It was pain with a purpose. He stepped into his hallway and saw it there, Margaret's photo, framed above their wedding cross. Her smile was timeless, warm, and fierce in its quiet way. He touched the frame gently, murmured, "I'm okay," though it was a lie. Across town, Officer Danny Morrison sat in a cramped conference room at the Brentwood Police Department, his fingers laced tightly on the table. He hadn't slept either. His mind kept replaying the sound, the low, primal cry that had escaped Roland's throat when the taser hit. It wasn't a sound he'd ever heard before. It wasn't pain, Not entirely. It was something older, something deeper, a sorrow that had clawed its way out of a man's chest. Captain Rourke stood before him now, stern and unblinking, holding the preliminary report in one hand and the body cam footage on a laptop in the other. "Explain to me," Rourke said slowly, "how a decorated veteran ended up face down in a cemetery with 3 officers standing over him like he was a threat to national security." Danny looked down. "Sir, the cemetery was closed. I responded to a report."
"I've read the report," Rourke interrupted, voice growing colder. "I've also seen the footage. You ignored the context, you ignored his grief, and you escalated a situation that never should have gone past a conversation." Danny swallowed hard. "I followed procedure." "No," Rourke said. "You followed protocol. There's a difference. Procedure is paperwork, protocol is judgment, and you failed at the latter." There was a long silence. Outside, the buzz of early reporters gathering at the department's gates drifted through the cracked window. Danny opened his mouth, but couldn't find anything worth saying. His badge suddenly felt heavier than it had the day he earned it. At the same time, at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, Tommy Rodriguez stood before a group of men and women, veterans spanning generations. Some wore faded Marine hats, others polished boots and starched shirts that still carried the creases of military pride. Tommy's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it. "We didn't do anything extraordinary yesterday," he said. "We did what we were trained to do, protect our own." There were nods around the room. Someone in the back murmured, "Damn right." Roland Kemper stood by his wife's grave to say goodbye. He was arrested for grieving too long, and let me be clear, this is bigger than Roland. This is about how our country treats its veterans. This is about what kind of America we want to live in. He paused. "The press is outside. They're hungry for a headline, but we're not going to give them spectacle. We're going to give them truth, dignity, and a unified front." A woman in her late 50s raised her hand. "My father knew Roland from Korea. Said he was the kind of guy who'd give you his last meal if you were cold. We owe him." Tommy nodded. "We do." Back at Roland's house, a knock came at the door. He opened it slowly, unsure of who to expect. It was a young woman with short dark hair and a clipboard. "Mr. Kemper? I'm Carla Davis from the Brentwood Community Outreach. We're here to offer any support you might need. Legal aid, trauma counseling, even help with daily errands." Roland looked at her as if he didn't quite believe she was real. You don't have to do that," he said softly. Carla smiled. "No, sir, we get to." Behind her stood 2 young high school volunteers with grocery bags. One of them wore a Navy ROTC hoodie. Roland felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Hope. That afternoon, Roland sat in his kitchen, sipping tea while Carla reviewed paperwork from the hospital and police department. His hand still shook, but not as much as before. The house didn't feel quite as empty now. They've suspended the soft wind. "I don't want an apology," he said. "I want change." Carla nodded. "Then that's what we'll fight for." By the next morning, the story had exploded online. Headlines read, "Veteran tasered at wife's grave, sparks national outrage. Honor versus authority, the arrest that shook a community. From Bronze Star to handcuffs, America reacts." News outlets from across the country requested interviews. Roland declined them all. He didn't want fame. He wanted his wife. Failing that, he wanted justice, for her, for himself, and for every veteran who'd ever felt forgotten. 3 days after the incident, a candlelight vigil was held at Oakwood Cemetery. Hundreds attended. Veterans came in uniform.
Children carried signs that read, "Grief is not a crime." Tommy stood beside Roland as he approached Margaret's grave again. This time, no officers blocked his path. No handcuffs waited in the shadows. Only candlelight, silence, and solidarity. Roland placed his hand on the headstone. "I told you I'd come back." Tommy stepped forward, handed Roland a folded flag, Margaret's. "She was proud of you, sir. And we are too." The old soldier nodded, the tears silent but steady. As the crowd held their candles aloft, a Marine bugler played taps. The notes drifted into the night, echoing across the headstones like a sacred promise. Never forgotten. Never alone. Oakwood Cemetery had never seen anything like this. What began as a quiet morning of mourning had spiraled into a clash of generations, principles, and authority. Roland Kemper, a man who had faced bullets and bombs without trembling, now sat in the back of a patrol car with handcuffs biting into his wrists, confusion and sorrow clouding his eyes. He had not raised his voice, had not lifted a hand in resistance. But the sting of a taser still pulsed through his body. Around him, the cold October wind whispered through the oak trees, as if they too were appalled by what had just occurred. News had spread faster than any siren could travel. Word of an old veteran being arrested at his wife's grave reached the ears and hearts of those who understood service, not through protocol, but through blood, sweat, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to arrive. He didn't come alone. Wearing his Marine dress blues, Tommy looked like a man pulled out of a recruitment poster. But his presence was not about pride, it was about duty. The other 6 Marines beside him, also in uniform, had left jobs, homes, and family plans to be here. No one had to be convinced. Roland Kemper was one of their own. A Bronze Star recipient. A man who had served with dignity, raised a family, and buried his wife with grace. They entered the cemetery in silence. Their polished shoes tapped in unison against the pavement, the rhythm sharp and deliberate. Each step said, "We see you. We hear you. We're here now." People at the gates turned to watch. Mrs. Chen from the corner store clutched her phone, tears streaming down her face. She whispered to no one in particular, "They came for him. They didn't leave him alone." Inside the patrol car, Roland caught a glimpse of the movement. Uniforms, straight backs, young faces, firm eyes. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. Maybe it was the electricity still running through his body. Or maybe it was something deeper, his body remembering the feeling of being protected, of not standing alone in the chaos. The lead Marine, Tommy, stepped forward toward Officer Morrison. "Sir," he said evenly, without malice or bravado, "we're here on behalf of Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper." Morrison hesitated. His authority, once firm and unchallenged, now wavered under the weight of what was unfolding. The presence of these Marines didn't just feel official, it felt moral. It felt correct. Something about the way they moved, the way they looked Morrison in the eye carried more weight than any badge. Tommy continued, "We request that you release this man immediately and explain the basis for his arrest." Morrison's mouth opened, then closed. He looked back at the other officers. Their confidence had also drained as the situation shifted. The body cameras were still recording, and the number of witnesses was growing. More cell phones were out now, more questions being asked. One woman, a middle school teacher, had gone live on Facebook. The patrol sergeant radioed in, trying to explain the escalating crowd and the uniformed men now flanking the patrol car. Somewhere along the line, it dawned on everyone involved. This was no longer just about rules. This was about judgment. It was about honor. And the side that had honor wasn't wearing a badge today. Tommy requested Roland's ID. The old veteran, still shaken, handed it over with trembling fingers. Tommy read it aloud for the others. Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper, U.S. Army, retired. Bronze Star for valor, 2 tours, honorably discharged. He turned to Morrison. You tased a decorated veteran at his wife's grave. There was no anger in his tone. That made it worse. There was only sorrow and disgust. Another Marine, a medic by training, asked if Roland could be seen for injuries. Morrison didn't respond. The silence answered for him. Finally, the supervisor from the precinct arrived, Captain Elise Turner. A veteran herself. She took one look at the situation and immediately understood the gravity of what had occurred. "Get those cuffs off him," she ordered. The officers hesitated. "That's not a request," she added, more sharply now. "Do it! Now!" One of the backup officers stepped forward with a key, carefully unlocking the cuffs around Roland's wrists. The elderly man winced as the metal slid away from his skin. Tommy and the medic helped him out of the car. He could barely stand, but he straightened himself as best he could. Captain Turner approached him directly. "Mr. Kemper," she said, "I am deeply sorry. This should never have happened." Roland looked at her, eyes weary but clear. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he whispered, "to my wife." "I know," she said quietly. "And you still can." She turned to Morrison, her eyes cold now. "You and I will be having a very long conversation, after you're relieved of duty for today." Morrison opened his mouth, but there was nothing to say. His certainty had turned to fear, his authority crumbling like wet paper in the hands of people who understood what integrity truly meant. With help from the Marines, Roland walked slowly back to Margaret's grave. The rose petals were still there, the headstone still fresh. The sky, gray and heavy, seemed to lower itself in quiet respect. The 7 Marines stood around the grave like sentinels. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply bore witness, as Roland finally said what he came to say. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he whispered, kneeling gently beside her. "I didn't mean to be late. You know how the world is sometimes, but I'm here now. I'm here, love." He pulled from his jacket pocket a small, folded photograph, one from their wedding day. Margaret was smiling, radiant even in her simple dress. Roland placed it at the base of the headstone and pressed his fingers to the cool stone. "Thank you for giving me a life worth defending," he said. Behind him, not a single Marine looked away. Not one officer dared interrupt. This was sacred ground now, and the world knew it. Back at the cemetery gates, members of the community began bringing flowers. Some laid them near the road, others at the fence. It had become a vigil, not just for Margaret, but for Roland, for every veteran who had ever been forgotten, for every moment when authority got it wrong and honor had to set it right. As dusk fell, the news vans arrived. They didn't come for a headline. They came for the truth. Oakwood Police Department was now in full crisis mode. Captain Elise Turner had already suspended Officer Morrison, pending an internal affairs investigation. Though the decision was swift, the public backlash was even swifter. Overnight, protesters appeared outside the precinct. Some were veterans, standing silently in formation. Others were ordinary citizens, carrying handmade signs that read, "Service deserves respect. We will not forget Roland. This is America, not a police state." The mayor of the town, Cassandra Lee, held a press conference. It was short, direct, and laced with something rare, remorse. "What happened to Mr. Roland Kemper is unacceptable. It has shaken the faith of our community. And it should. We failed him. We failed his wife's memory, and we will make this right, not just with apologies, but with action." But Roland didn't attend that press conference. He didn't watch it either, because Roland wasn't concerned with statements anymore. He was trying to recover, not just from the physical trauma of the taser, but from the emotional wreckage of what had been taken from him. A home turned cold. Roland sat in his small home, the same one he had shared with Margaret for over 40 years. Everything inside whispered of her. The floral curtains she had chosen, the wooden rocking chair by the window, the framed embroidery that read, "Grow old with me, the best is yet to be." Except now, there was no more yet to be. And the house, once full of warmth, felt like a museum, beautiful, still, and achingly empty. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee. Across from him sat his daughter, Amelia. She had flown in from Seattle the night of the arrest. Amelia looked just like her mother, same soft eyes, same calm strength. But today her expression was tight, protective, angry. "How are you feeling, Daddy?" she asked softly. Roland took a breath, but it came out shallow. "Like I got punched by lightning and mugged by memory," he said with a wry smile. Amelia didn't laugh. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "They humiliated you. They hurt you." "I've been hurt before, baby," he replied, patting her hand, "but I've never been humiliated in a cemetery, not even in war." Amelia's voice caught in her throat. "You deserve better. Mom deserved better." Roland nodded, his gaze distant. "I don't want this to be about a hashtag," he said. "I want to visit her in peace. I want to cry without being punished for it." Unlikely visitors. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Roland opened it to find a young woman in her early 30s. She was dressed in plain clothes but wore a look of solemn respect. Behind her stood a cameraman. "Mr. Kemper," she said gently, "I'm Lena Ortiz. I work for the American Light. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you're comfortable." Roland hesitated, but something about her demeanor, humble, quiet, made him nod. They set up in the living room. Lena didn't ask him about the arrest. She didn't ask about the taser. She asked him about Margaret. What was she like? Roland smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached his eyes. She had this way of looking at people like she saw straight through the nonsense, he began. Didn't matter if you were a senator or a janitor, if you weren't kind, you didn't get far with her. He paused, running a finger along the side of his coffee cup. She believed in listening more than speaking, and she loved birds, had feeders all over the yard. Cardinals were her favorite. She used to say they were messengers from heaven. Lena let him talk. No interruptions, no sensationalism. She didn't want a soundbite. She wanted a story, and Roland, in his quiet, dignified way, gave her one. A love story stretched across decades, sealed in hardship, lifted by laughter, and now laid to rest beside a headstone that had become a battleground of principle. Rising support. By evening, Lena's interview had been seen over 6 million times. Veterans from across the country posted messages of solidarity. A retired Navy SEAL in Florida said, "You mess with one of ours. You mess with all of us." A group of college students in Boston started a petition demanding national policy change regarding how law enforcement handles elderly and disabled citizens, especially at cemeteries. Within 24 hours, it had gathered 350,000 signatures. At Roland's church, Father Marcus lit a candle for Margaret during Sunday Mass. He spoke not of outrage, but of legacy. What Roland Kemper endured should break our hearts, not just our silence. Let his pain teach us. Let his love for his wife remind us of what dignity looks like, even when the world forgets. Morrison speaks, but the story took another turn. Because 3 days after the incident, Officer Morrison requested to speak publicly. He did so from his attorney's office, sitting stiffly in front of microphones, visibly rattled. "I made a mistake," he began. "I saw an old man alone and thought he was suspicious. That was profiling. I admit it. I was wrong." His voice cracked. "I didn't recognize him as a veteran. I didn't recognize his pain. I failed to show compassion, and I will live with that failure for the rest of my life." Some saw it as an attempt at damage control, but others, including Roland, saw something else. Regret. Genuine, heavy regret. When Amelia asked him how he felt about Morrison's statement, Roland simply said, "I've seen a lot of men try to be brave after the fact. But owning your mistake is its own kind of battle." The visit. That night, Roland returned to the cemetery. This time, he wasn't stopped. This time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of people stood at the edge of the grounds, some veterans, some neighbors, some strangers who had driven hours just to bear witness. They didn't approach. They didn't crowd. They just stood, watching, respecting. Roland knelt at Margaret's grave and placed fresh roses by her headstone. Then he whispered softly, "They remember you now, Maggie. They remember us. Maybe the world ain't all bad." A red cardinal landed on the edge of the grave. He watched it for a long moment before standing. The wind stirred again through the trees, and Roland felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The days following the incident at Oakwood Cemetery were a blur of confusion, noise, and unexpected momentum. Roland Kemper, a man who had always chosen quiet dignity over attention, now found himself at the center of a growing storm that refused to be ignored. It began with the videos. Cell phone footage taken by the bystanders, especially the one recorded by a teenager named Malik Washington, had gone viral overnight. The clip, less than 2 minutes long, showed Roland being tasered while trying to speak, flanked by cold October wind and fading roses at the foot of Margaret's grave. It was brutal, raw, heartbreaking. But above all, it was real. That reality struck a nerve. Thousands of people across the country watched and rewatched the video, stunned by the image of a 70-year-old veteran in handcuffs, his head bowed, the folded American flag still peeking from his coat pocket. There was no background music, no dramatic editing, just the truth, unfiltered. And truth has a way of moving people. Within 48 hours, news outlets from local affiliates to national platforms picked up the story. Some framed it as a tragic misunderstanding, others as an example of systemic issues in law enforcement. But what united them all was the image of Roland, grieving, restrained, and humiliated at his wife's final resting place. Reporters descended on Oakwood Cemetery, on Roland's modest home, and even the VFW hall where Roland and Tommy Rodriguez had first met. But Roland remained silent. He didn't want interviews. He didn't want headlines. He wanted only what he'd been denied that day: peace. It was Tommy who broke the silence first. He stood at a press conference outside the VFW hall, wearing his Marine dress blues, flanked by 6 of the Marines who had shown up that day. His voice was calm, measured, a stark contrast to the outrage pulsing through the community. "This isn't about just one man," Tommy began. "This is about how we treat the people who gave us the freedoms we take for granted. Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper earned the right to stand at his wife's grave. That should never have been in question. But it was. And we have to ask why. He didn't scream. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth. And that's what made people listen. Within hours, support for Roland exploded. Veterans groups from across the country issued statements of solidarity. Retired generals, Gold Star families, and even active duty soldiers began sharing their own stories of indignities and misunderstandings. Some were minor, others horrific. But they all shared a common thread, a sense that the country they'd served sometimes forgot what that service cost. Roland's mailbox overflowed. Letters came in bundles, from school children and senators alike. Some enclosed medals from old soldiers who wanted Roland to know he wasn't alone. Others sent pictures of their own loved ones in uniform, promising to teach their children about men like him. But Roland remained quiet. He read every letter, eyes misting at times, hands trembling, but he refused interviews. When his son called from Oregon, urging him to speak to the media, Roland simply said, "I'm not interested in being famous. I just miss your mother." But something inside Roland had changed. Not anger, not bitterness, resolve. He began attending city council meetings, sitting quietly in the back, his presence impossible to ignore. He met with veteran groups, spoke softly to police reform advocates, and even accepted an invitation to meet with the mayor, a former Navy officer herself. At one meeting, a local reporter caught up with him as he was leaving the building. "Mr. Kemper," she asked, "what would you like to see happen after all this?" He paused, adjusting the flag pin on his lapel. "I want them to listen," he said simply. "Not to me, to each other, to what's right. I want them to remember that respect isn't a policy, it's a choice." That soundbite aired on national television. It struck a chord deeper than outrage. It became a mantra for the growing movement. "Listen with Respect" began trending. Young people started tagging videos of their grandparents telling stories about their service. Police departments across the country initiated public discussions about handling interactions with elderly citizens. Officers were retrained, policies rewritten. Meanwhile, Morrison, the young officer who had tasered Roland, faced a very different reality. An internal investigation had begun almost immediately. His body cam footage contradicted some of his initial statements. Public pressure mounted, not just for disciplinary action, but for cultural change within the department. Morrison had returned to desk duty, shielded from media but not from public scrutiny. He was 25 years old and drowning in a storm of his own making. But behind the closed doors of the precinct, something unexpected began to happen. Other officers, some older and hardened, began talking about Roland, not as a suspect, but as a symbol. Some defended Morrison, saying he was just following procedure. Others, more quietly, admitted that maybe the procedures were wrong. One sergeant, a 35-year veteran of the force, made a quiet observation in the locker room one night. "We don't get to define respect by the badge we wear," he said. "We define it by how we treat people who can't fight back." It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Back at home, Roland kept busy. He polished Margaret's headstone. He replanted the flowers by the porch. He wrote back to every letter he received, including one from a high school student named Eva in Detroit, who had written, "My grandfather served in Vietnam, and your story helped me understand him more." Roland wrote her a 4-page letter in return, telling her what Detroit was like in 1975, what the cold felt like on a tarmac overseas, and how love, real love, was worth every scar. One afternoon, Tommy visited with coffee and a copy of the local paper. "Look," he said, pointing to the front page. "City Council's voting on a new ordinance, the Kemper Act." Roland raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Tommy read, "It requires officers to complete additional de-escalation training for interactions with the elderly and mandates oversight when force is used on any individual over 65. It also designates cemeteries as protected spaces for mourning, regardless of visiting hours. Roland didn't smile. He just nodded once. Margaret would have liked that, he said. That night, he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the oak trees, just like he used to with Margaret. The wind picked up, rustling the flags on the front lawn. One American, one Marine Corps. He clutched the last letter he'd received from a woman named Leela in Kansas. Her son had served in Iraq and never returned. She wrote, "Seeing how people stood up for you gave me hope again. Maybe someday someone will stand up for my boy's memory too." Roland folded the letter, tucked it inside his coat, and whispered to the night sky, "We're not forgotten, Maggie." For the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. But beyond his porch, beyond Oakwood Cemetery, the story was still spreading. Because people were listening. And they refused to be silent. The morning sun broke over the rooftops of the quiet town, casting golden rays across the community that had been shaken awake. What had begun as a tragic moment of grief for Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper had become a reckoning. The arrest, the tasering, the image of an elderly veteran lying on the cold ground beside his wife's grave had spread like wildfire, not just through town, not just on veterans' forums, but across the country. National news outlets picked up the story. Headlines splashed across screens. Veteran arrested at wife's grave. Bronze Star recipient tased during mourning. Marines confront police over abuse of elderly vet. The story struck a nerve, especially among veterans, military families, and civil rights advocates. The injustice was clear, but now came the harder part: accountability. At the center of the storm, Roland sat quietly in his modest living room, flanked by stacks of letters. Cards had arrived from as far away as Alaska and Maine. Some were written in careful cursive by World War II survivors. Others came typed from students who had read about him in their civics class. Many came from fellow soldiers who knew exactly what it felt like to give your best years to a country and then wonder if anyone remembered. Tommy Rodriguez had become something of a spokesperson, not officially, but in spirit. The young Marine had handled interview requests with dignity, always redirecting praise to Roland. "I didn't do anything special," he said during one televised segment. "I just showed up for a brother. That's what Marines do." But the media storm had forced institutions into action. The Oakwood Police Department called a press conference. Chief Angela Morales, a veteran officer herself, and a Latina who had long advocated for reform within the department, stepped up to the podium, her face tight with resolve. "We failed Sergeant Kemper," she began, her voice steady. "What happened at Oakwood Cemetery was unacceptable. Our officers misjudged the situation, used force unnecessarily, and showed a grave lack of compassion. This is not who we are, and it will not be tolerated." She announced that Officer Danny Morrison had been placed on unpaid leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation. 2 other officers involved were reassigned to desk duty. But for many in the community, and across the nation, that wasn't enough. Civil rights attorney Camille Braxton stepped forward next. She had been contacted by the local VFW chapter to represent Roland pro bono. A formidable presence in the courtroom, she had taken on police brutality cases in the past, but rarely had she seen such a stark combination of disrespect and trauma. "Mr. Kemper didn't just lose his wife," she said during a press conference. "He lost his dignity at the hands of those who swore to protect him. We are filing a lawsuit not just for damages, but for answers." The lawsuit targeted the police department, the city, and individual officers involved. It cited violations of Roland's civil rights, emotional distress, and excessive force. But Camille's real goal was broader: policy change. Roland wasn't a man for lawsuits or limelight. He told Camille so plainly. But she explained gently, "Mr. Kemper, this isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to the next grieving husband, the next veteran, the next human being." So he agreed. Meanwhile, public opinion shifted quickly. Petitions gathered tens of thousands of signatures demanding Morrison's termination. News anchors openly questioned how any officer could fail to see the humanity of a grieving old man. On veteran-run media channels, Roland became a quiet symbol of forgotten sacrifice. Yet, even amid all the noise, Roland remained himself, humble, quiet, and, above all, wounded. Not just physically from the taser, which had left a lingering tremor in his left hand, but spiritually. He hadn't wanted attention. He just wanted to say goodbye to Margaret. Now, Margaret's memory was entangled in something bigger. He feared it would overshadow the love they had shared. But it was Tommy who reminded him one evening over coffee, "You're still serving, Sergeant, just in a different way now." The public outcry led to formal investigations from multiple angles. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division quietly opened an inquiry into the Oakwood Police Department's training practices, particularly around elderly citizens, mental health, and veterans. The City Council called an emergency meeting, open to the public. For the first time in years, the hall was packed. Dozens lined up to speak. Most didn't know Roland personally, but all felt they owed him something. One woman said, "My grandfather served in Korea. What happened to Mr. Kemper could have happened to him. We owe our veterans better." Others were angry, not just at the police, but at what they saw as a growing culture of overreach and lack of empathy. Yet amid the frustration, there was resolve. This wouldn't end in silence. At the center of it all, Officer Danny Morrison was silent. His name had become a lightning rod. Journalists dug into his background. He'd graduated top of his academy class, but had no prior military experience, and some criticized his lack of empathy or training in de-escalation. Former classmates described him as ambitious, eager to prove himself, but also rigid, by the book to a fault. He declined interviews, but off the record, colleagues shared that he was shaken, not just by the backlash, but by something deeper: shame. Morrison had joined the force to help people. Now he was a symbol of the very thing he'd sworn to fight. And yet, there was one voice Morrison hadn't heard: Roland's. Until one afternoon, 6 weeks after the incident, when Morrison requested a private meeting, not through media or lawyers, but through Chief Morales. He asked to speak to Roland face to face. Roland agreed. The meeting was arranged at the local VFW hall. Just Roland, Morrison, and 2 silent observers, Camille and Morales. Roland sat in his usual quiet dignity, shoulders squared despite his age. Morrison looked younger than ever, nervous, unsure. He spoke first. "I failed you," Morrison said. "I didn't see you. I saw a problem to solve, not a person, not a husband, not a soldier." Roland didn't speak right away. He let the words settle in the silence. "I don't hate you," Roland said finally, "but I do pity you, because somewhere along the way, they trained you to follow rules, but not your heart." Morrison's eyes welled up, and Roland continued, "I stood in that cemetery because I'd just lost the only person who ever understood me completely. And you came up with handcuffs like I was trash. That's going to live in both our memories for the rest of our lives." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Morrison nodded slowly, eyes cast downward. "I want to be better," he said softly. "Then make it mean something," Roland replied. Fix what broke inside you before it breaks someone else. The meeting ended without hugs or forgiveness, but with something harder and perhaps more powerful. Truth. In the weeks that followed, Morrison withdrew his badge and entered a program for officers dealing with trauma and moral injury. He later began working with a community outreach team, educating rookie cops on compassion and perspective. The lawsuit continued, but Roland didn't need a courtroom to feel vindicated. The apology wasn't perfect, but it had been real. And in that, Roland found peace. One evening, standing again at Margaret's grave, Roland brought her up to date. He whispered about the news coverage, the lawsuit, the apology. And then he told her what mattered most. I remembered who I am, Maggie. And they remembered too. The leaves danced across the cemetery ground, and for a moment, it felt like she was listening. The lawsuit moved through the courts with the slow grind of justice. Camille Braxton, ever sharp and relentless, continued to file motions and depositions, determined not just to win the case, but to expose every crack in the system that allowed an elderly war hero to be treated like a criminal. The town of Oakwood, once quiet and mostly forgotten, had now become a national mirror, forcing America to look at itself. But Roland Kemper had no appetite for fame or crusades. He wanted something simpler: silence, honesty, dignity, and healing. Weeks after the meeting with Officer Morrison, Roland found himself drawn once again to the place that had become both sacred and scarring: the cemetery. But this time, it was different. He wasn't alone. A small group of veterans, some local, some from nearby states, had organized what they called a Walk of Honor. It was not a protest, not a march, not political. It was personal. Men and women, some in uniform, some in wheelchairs, some with PTSD visible in their twitching hands or faraway stares, gathered to walk together, silently, down the main road of Oakwood to the cemetery. They carried no signs, only small American flags. Roland had hesitated to join. He didn't want spectacle. But when he saw Tommy Rodriguez standing outside his house with a folded Marine Corps flag and a quiet nod, he knew he couldn't say no. The walk began at dawn. There were no cameras allowed, no speeches, no chants, just the sound of boots and canes, crutches, and wheeled walkers, as veterans of wars from Korea to Afghanistan made their way together to Margaret's grave. When they arrived, they didn't speak. Each one took a knee beside the grave for a moment, placed their flag into the earth, and saluted. And then they left. It was Roland's turn, last. He stood for a long moment before kneeling. His body protested the motion, his knees ached, his back cried out, but he did it anyway. Then, softly, he said the words that had carried him through decades of war and peace. Semper Fi, my love. He stayed there until the sun was high. Not because he needed to, but because he finally could. Without fear, without interruption, without shame. That walk marked a shift in the town. Mayor Daniels, who had once called Roland an unfortunate case, now stood on the courthouse steps beside Camille Braxton and publicly pledged to implement mandatory de-escalation training for all city officers, including those dealing with elderly citizens and veterans. He also pushed forward funding for a Veterans Outreach Coordinator, a new position meant to bridge the gap between service members and local law enforcement. Roland, reluctantly, became involved. Not in politics, but in listening. Once a week, he began volunteering at the town hall, where he'd sit with officers in training and simply talk. Not about rules, about experience. He told them about the noise of artillery in Vietnam, about holding a friend's hand as he bled out in Helmand Province. He talked about what it felt like to be 23 and know your best friend had just died in a jungle, and what it felt like to be 83 and feel like your country forgot. At first, the young recruits didn't know what to say, but slowly they started asking questions. Some brought coffee. Some brought their own stories. One, a rookie named Amanda Chen, said, "My grandfather served in Korea. I never really got to ask him about it before he died. Listening to you makes me feel like I'm hearing his voice." For Roland, it was therapy. Not the kind that came with couches and questions, but the kind that came with truth and service. His days began to fill again, not with the old routines he'd had when Margaret was alive, but new ones. Once a week, he and Tommy met for lunch at a diner called Lila's, where the waitress never let Roland pay. On Saturdays, he read poetry at the local library's Veterans Club, even reciting some of Margaret's favorite Emily Dickinson verses. But the shadows never fully left. At night, sometimes, he would wake with a start, heart pounding, body aching from the shock of that day. The memory of the taser, the sudden pain, the helplessness. The worst memory, Margaret lying just a few feet away, and him unable to hold her. PTSD, long dormant, had resurfaced in a new form. Camille encouraged him to speak with a trauma counselor at the VA. Roland agreed, but only after finding out the counselor was a woman who had served 2 tours in Iraq. He didn't want pity. He wanted understanding. Their sessions were slow, like walking through mud. But in time, he began to name things he hadn't dared say before. He admitted the rage, the humiliation, the bone-deep grief. He also spoke of his love. How Margaret had once walked 3 miles in the rain to bring him lunch after he forgot his sandwich. How she'd danced with him in the living room even when no music was playing. How she'd made him believe every single day that he was more than his scars. "She saw me," he told the counselor one afternoon, "even when I didn't know who I was." Healing, the counselor said, often begins with being seen. Meanwhile, the lawsuit neared its climax. Camille, never one to play theatrics, prepared her final arguments. The city's lawyers had tried to settle quietly, offering a large sum with a non-disclosure clause. Roland refused. "They took my voice," he said. "They don't get to buy my silence." In court, Camille delivered a closing argument that made the room hold its breath. "This is not just about Mr. Kemper," she said. "This is about every invisible person our systems fail to see. This is about age and race and uniform. About the gap between service and memory. We call men like Mr. Kemper heroes, but we treat them like burdens. That has to change." The jury deliberated for 3 days. They awarded Roland $3.2 million in damages. More than money, it was a message. The city was found liable for negligence, excessive force, and emotional harm. But Roland didn't celebrate. He donated nearly all of the award. Some went to the Oakwood Veterans Center, some to a scholarship fund for children of fallen soldiers, and a significant chunk to a newly formed nonprofit, the Margaret Foundation, dedicated to ensuring that no elderly veteran ever had to face public spaces alone. The town changed. New signs appeared in the cemetery. Quiet zone, respect grieving families. Police cars were equipped with training manuals and QR codes linking to de-escalation video modules. And Morrison? He never returned to street patrol, but he continued his work in community outreach. One day, he gave a talk at the same Veterans Center Roland now frequented. They passed each other in the hallway. Morrison stopped. "Still listening, Sergeant?" Roland nodded. "Always." They shook hands. Firm, no fanfare. Months passed, and then came Memorial Day. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Roland stood at the front of the ceremony, not in uniform, not giving a speech, but simply present. When his name was called, and the town applauded, he stepped forward, held up a hand, and said only this: "Remember the quiet ones, the ones who carry more than medals, and honor them while they're still breathing." Then he stepped down. The applause was thunderous, but Roland's eyes were fixed on one spot, a small headstone beneath an oak tree, where Margaret rested. He smiled. The war wasn't over, but peace had finally begun.